Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched Dickinson season 2. Let's talk about it. So Dickinson season 2 has finally wrapped up, and honestly I have been kind of dreading making my review for this series because my thoughts on this series especially are quite jumbled. They're all over the place, kind of like the show itself, so I really need to make an effort to organize my thoughts so that we can tackle some themes and character arcs that are explored throughout this series. But before we get down to it, as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Okay, so without further ado, let's dive into this. So first up, the first theme that I wanted to explore in my review of season 2 of Dickinson is Emily's poems. Last time we saw Emily, who is wonderfully and quite dramatically portrayed by Hailee Steinfeld. She was eager to get her poems out into the world and for once get some fame and acclaim for her work. She was eager to pursue her passion for poetry regardless of what society said, and she was eager to get these poems published so that she could share her words with the rest of the world beyond just her family members. Now this topic very much highlights one of the issues that this series has when it comes to reconciling this version of Emily that they've created in the series, who is incredibly confident. She very much holds 21st century ideals of feminism and of, art and how it should be viewed in the world. Just a lot of these ideals that we see that are very much contemporary to this time as opposed to the time that she's supposed to be from, and so it's very anachronistic in a lot of ways. That is very much highlighted by the juxtaposition between the 19th century aesthetic and costuming with the very much 21st century music. But I feel like it's very difficult to reconcile the depiction of this character with the real life person, the real life woman who lived historically, because we know from history that the vast majority of Emily Dickinson's poems, of which there were over like 1,000, I think, they were published after she died. So she didn't get that fame while she was still alive, and so this character's pursuit of fame and of acclaim during her lifetime is misguided, because we know ultimately that's not what happened to the real life Emily Dickinson. So this creates an issue whereby the show has to kind of justify or explain why Emily shouldn't be famous, why she shouldn't pursue fame and acclaim for her poems, because ultimately the show, and we know that she's not going to be famous during her lifetime, she's going to be famous for her works after she's already passed. But Emily doesn't know that. Ultimately, Emily isn't aware of her fate, so the show has to find a way to get her to that end point, and unfortunately it overdoes it. It overdoes it in my opinion. I feel like it bends over backwards doing all these gymnastics, cartwheels, acrobatics to get Emily to come to the conclusion that fame and acclaim and recognition for her work is not something that she wants to pursue. The main storylines here, first of all, you have the nobody character, right? So the nobody character shows up at the beginning of the series as this ominous ghost-like figure, and he's supposed to guide her towards this conclusion that she doesn't want to pursue fame, and that especially comes to fruition in that episode where she does actually publish one of her poems for the first time in the newspaper that Sam is the editor-in-chief of. We'll get to Sam in a second. I have a lot of thoughts on that character. But in this episode, the story device that's used here is Emily has become completely invisible to everyone around her, apart from a certain person, which again we'll go through later on. But she becomes completely invisible. No one can see her on the day that she most wants to be seen, because this is a character who's often, holed up in her room. She's content with being forgotten by the rest of the world as long as she has her poems, as long as she has her imagination with her. But in this episode, the one time where she has shared that very personal aspect of her character with the rest of the world, she becomes invisible. She becomes completely unseen, which means that she can't really get that praise and that acclaim that she wanted directly. But it also means that she's able to see the real and authentic and visceral responses of the characters around her to her poem being published. And that's a very interesting experience. I think it's a very clever story device to use in order to get Emily to understand how the world would process and kind of receive her art. It's just this array of different reactions to her artwork that makes her realize that she's not quite ready to have something that's so personal and so intrinsically a part of her being to be shared with the rest of the world that will receive it in such an array of ways. So when it comes to this explanation for why Emily shouldn't pursue fame and fortune and acclaim for her poems, I thought it was pretty good. I felt like I enjoyed that episode where she becomes invisible to almost everyone in her life a lot. Like I said, I think it was an excellent storytelling device to allow her to see the reactions, the authentic reactions of the people around her. My only issue with that kind of storyline is the nobody guy, the Mr. Nobody. He was quite convenient, you know, he was quite convenient. He kind of edges on that supernatural spectrum that Emily seems to as well, especially when you take into account her relationship with Death, who is portrayed by Wiz Khalifa. Genius. I love that, by the way. But yeah, ultimately I do feel like he was quite convenient to kind of be there to push her in the direction that the show wanted her to go in, because that is the ultimate fate that Emily Dickinson meets in real life. I will say though, on the topic of Mr. Nobody, I was fully content with him being like an actual ghost-like being that was a representative of all of the soldiers that were about to head off to fight in the American Civil War. I was happy with him having no identity, quite frankly. So the next reason that we get for why Emily should not pursue fame and fortune and acclaim for her poems is Sam. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about Mr. Samuel Bowles, okay? He sucks. He absolutely sucks. Listen, this has nothing to do with the fact that he's portrayed by Finn Jones. I think Finn Jones is great. I think he was a pretty good Iron Fist, especially in season 2 of the show. I think the first season was... we don't need to talk about the first season of Iron Fist in this review. What am I talking about? But anyways, I think he's good. I think he's pretty good in this role as well. It has nothing to do with him, but everything to do with the character that he represents, because Sam absolutely sucks for so many reasons. But one of the reasons is, at the beginning at least, that he is flaky as hell, because he says that he wants to commit to publishing Emily's poems, but his actions say otherwise. He is so flaky that he doesn't show, you know, outright commitment and passion for Emily's poems, at least not consistently. It seems as though the second he has them in his hands, the second he's won them like they're trophies or something, he's no longer actually interested in pursuing Emily or her poems. The second that he's actually able to obtain them and actually able to publish them as he promised he would do, all of a sudden it's delays, all of a sudden it's lack of communication, all of a sudden he's leaving her on red, basically. It's what a horrible character. And quite frankly, I did actually also think that he wanted to pursue Emily more romantically as opposed to career-wise, but that turns out to be untrue for reasons that we'll talk about in a second. But I just think the character overall, if we're just speaking professionally and in terms of his, you know, newspaper and how he wants to profit off of war that's about slavery. He's just money hungry. He's just focused on his profits and the profits of his newspaper, and he thinks that this upcoming war is a good thing for his newspaper. So already we know the kind of character that we're dealing with here, and it's not the kind of character that Emily should be in bed with, both figuratively and literally. But as for the show actually presenting Sam as one of the reasons why Emily should not pursue getting published, I would say that it's less convincing somehow. It's less convincing than the supernatural being that sometimes visits her, because whilst the character of Sam sucks, and he absolutely does for numerous reasons, which we'll get to again later on, but he's not the only person that would publish her poems, right? Like she could go elsewhere, although to be fair, during this time maybe she is restricted in who she could actually approach to publish her poems with. And again, on this front you see this conflict that arises here, where you have a show that has created this incredibly ambitious, incredibly determined, headstrong female character who exists in a world, in a time where that is very much looked down upon and is often encouraged to be suppressed. But at the same time, the show is trying to suppress her itself, because it knows that ultimately the real Emily Dickinson's destiny doesn't really align with the one that is being set up by the fictional one in the show. Okay, so next up, let's talk about Emily and Sue. Now, if I'm being honest, I wasn't the biggest fan of Sue for this season. I'm so sorry. I felt like she became so obnoxious, so up herself, so unlikable, especially the way that she was treating Austin. I found that to be, quite frankly, very abrasive towards me, very offensive towards me, because I very much like the character of Austin. Now, I would have been more understanding if the series actually committed to exploring the after effects, you know, the side effects of Sue having suffered that miscarriage, because I initially thought that that was the direction that they were headed towards at the beginning of this season, especially after that ending where you find out that Sue is pregnant. You know, soon afterwards, when you start off season 2, she's no longer pregnant, and I was expecting to see the fallout from that, but you don't really get that until like almost the very end, where she confronts Sam's wife, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, on the one hand, I do understand that they were trying to show that Sue is repressing the fact that she went through that miscarriage, the fact that she went through that trauma, and in order to do this, she's trying to reinvent herself into this 19th century it girl that the whole community knows about. You know, her parties are incredibly popular, her parties or soirees or whatever they're called are even reported on in the newspapers, although we know why that is the case now. But all of this is just a facade to hide the fact that she is still hurting. She is still emotionally impacted by the miscarriage that she suffered. And once again, I completely understand the outline of the character arc for Sue in this season. I just wish that they had leaned into it a little bit more. At the very least, have her be the one tell Austin that she went through that miscarriage and that she went through that pain on her own without him being aware of what happened. But let's talk about Emily and Sue this season, because I feel like their relationship very much took a back seat to the other storylines that were explored this season. The first one, of course, being Emily being published for the first time, but then also we have the fact that Sue has become this it girl, and that very much took center stage for her storyline. And so the ending of the series, where you have this reunion, this fated passionate reunion between the two, listen, I was happy to see it. Okay, I was glad to see it. I was like, yeah, this is what we need, this is what we want. We love to see this, you know, LGBTQ representation, so have at it, ladies. Like, this is fabulous. Okay, I will still say though, it didn't feel justified. It didn't feel like it was, you know, led up to properly, because their relationship has taken such a back seat. And on top of this, I was still kind of annoyed at Sue. Okay, I was giving her a bit of a side eye because she slept with Sam. She'd been sleeping with Sam, who was having an affair on his wife, who he was lying about, saying, you know, she's sick and all of this, even though she had also suffered a miscarriage, much like Sue had, and they kind of had that bonding moment where they discovered that this was something that they had in common. But Sue has been having an affair with Sam when she's married to Emily's brother, who is just the sweetest guy. I really didn't like the fact that she was treating Austin this way, but then she ends up in Emily's bed, and I'm just like, okay, this girl kind of sucks though. Like, I'm so sorry. Am I the only one who thinks that Sue kind of sucks? Like, she kind of sucks. Not as much as Sam, but like almost as much as Sam, because she's hurting even more people in this scenario. Like, Sam is only hurting his wife, really, and also Emily by, you know, deceiving her. But in the case of Sue, she's hurting Emily even more, and she's hurting Austin, and she's hurting herself ultimately. And also, I wasn't the biggest fan of the justification that she had when she did reunite with Emily, where she told Emily that, you know, the reason why she pushed Emily to get her poems published is because she could no longer handle having those poems for herself. She just needed Emily to, you know, put them out into the world so that she could feel better about the love that she has for her. And I was like, okay. Okay, maybe just don't read them anymore. I don't know. Like, I swear that she went through a phase where she wasn't reading Emily's poems anyway. Maybe just do that again? I don't know. But then she also said the reason why she slept with Sam is because she didn't want to feel anything, because, you know, when she realized that this overwhelming feeling of, you know, being in love with Emily was just getting the better of her, she decided to sleep with Sam. To which I say, but you're married though. She's married. She's married to Emily's brother. I just don't understand. And I also feel like Emily is compromising a lot of her morals here, because Austin is one of the few people who's really on her side. And in fact, as I alluded to earlier in that episode where Emily becomes invisible, he's the only person that can see her. Even Sue in that episode can't see her, just to show how far gone Sue has become at that point. So Austin is a really great character, and I just don't feel like he deserves to be treated this way by Sue or by Emily. Okay, so speaking of of Austin, clearly I'm a fan of the character. I feel like he very much has evolved from the character that we were introduced to in season 1, where he was basically just a caricature of a privileged white boy from the 19th century who was able to coast off of his father's success. And we do see a little bit of that play out in this season, especially with him having taken a partner role in his father's firm, even though he has no active role in it really. His father doesn't really give him any real responsibilities. Mr. Dickinson doesn't really take Austin's perspective on business or, you know, commercial awareness seriously. He just thinks that his son is a slacker who doesn't really contribute anything meaningful to their family nor to their family legacy. And he even says to Austin, at the very least, you know, Emily has her poetry, which is such a 180 from the character that we were introduced to in season 1, who didn't even want Emily picking up a pen. But whatever. He's come round to it, I guess, especially since Emily wouldn't take no for an answer, and he can at least acknowledge the fact that his daughter is passionate about poetry and has a talent for it, and he wishes that his son would show any such passion about anything, but in particular his role in the firm. But what Mr. Dickinson doesn't realize is that Austin does have somewhat of a passion about something, and that is, I guess, the abolitionist movement. Okay. So, white savior. Yes, white savior flags are flying. Yes, they are. Okay, this is an aspect of Austin's character where I'm side-eyeing the show a little bit, because on the one hand it does make sense. You know, at the end of the day, the abolitionist movement in a lot of ways was spearheaded by white saviors, you know, white people who were in positions of power, who were able to speak up and say that what was going on in the South and the transatlantic slave trade was bad. Maybe it's something we should reconsider. Okay, it did take that in order to push the abolitionist movement forward and eventually lead to a civil war. But the problem with creating somewhat of a white savior character in Austin is that it very much diminishes the contributions of the black people on this show. Like, the one thing that the black people on this show have is that they're disenfranchised and that they're working towards abolishing slavery and through this underground movement. But the fact that Austin has been made their kind of ally, it kind of takes some of the spotlight away from them and puts some on him. And that's usually the side effects that we see when you have a white savior character to begin with. It diminishes the contributions of the people who are, you know, the oppressed people, the affected groups that are trying to fight for their freedom. So yeah, I didn't love that aspect of the character, but I will still stand by my assertion that out of Sue and Austin, I would choose Austin any day, because Sue is quite frankly being a little bit suckish to me in my eyes. Okay, like, I know she's in love with Emily and Emily loves her, but she's married to Austin, and I'm guessing at this point Austin has just come to terms with the fact that their marriage won't look like, you know, the way that he thought it would, which is pretty sad. I feel like the show should have given Austin the time to kind of grieve his relationship with Sue, because he did love her. That was a huge storyline in the first season, so the fact that he's had to kind of give it up so easily, so readily, because he knows that Sue isn't fully committed to their relationship. He knows that Sue was cheating on him with Sam. I'm sorry, but having said that though, it seems as though that the show is trying to kind of remedy this by giving Austin a love interest in Grace, who has conveniently lost her husband after like the first season when she got married and it was official that, you know, Austin would not be pursuing her anymore because he had been married to Sue. So they went their separate ways, only to collide once again, this time with Grace and her child being involved, and she's now a widow, as she mentions repeatedly in the first half of the season. And so it seems as though they're kind of building up this relationship between Grace and Austin, and I think that's kind of a cop-out to basically make Sue a bit less hateable, because Austin has someone to fall back on. And lastly, I did want to quickly touch on the rest of the Dickinson gang. So first up, we have Lavinia, who is in this incredibly toxic relationship with Ship. Listen, Ship sucks. Ship sucks also. Listen, he doesn't want Lavinia, okay? He doesn't want Lavinia. He wants his idea of her, and his idea of her very much aligns with the period typical ideals of womanhood from that time, where she's a mother and a wife. She's very much a homemaker who's just interested in taking care of her household and her children, and of course her husband, providing him with anything that he needs. She's very submissive, she doesn't speak up for herself, and also she's not, you know, a sexual deviant, in that her sexuality is very much defined by what her husband wants want out of her as opposed to her own autonomy. And that's something that's very interestingly explored through the character of Lavinia and her relationship with Ship. And by the way, I love the fact that they highlight as well that Ship also sucks because he's basically one of those guys who gets like a new idea for a new venture every week but never really commits to anything. He's a bum basically. And I find it even more interesting that the show kind of plays into the archetype of the, you know, sexy sensual Latina character who's called Lola. And this isn't my favorite stereotype. I wish we could kind of get rid of it, but it makes sense through the lens of the character of Ship, who basically views women in this very two-dimensional way. But this character of Lola, who's clearly, you know, meets all of the stereotypes of a Latina, romantic, sensual, you know, overly sexualized character. She seems to have kind of traumatized him from pursuing that kind of woman, perhaps because she actually exercises her own autonomy, whatever. But that's why he's pursuing someone like Lavinia, or at least like Lavinia used to be. And then you have Mama and Papa Dickinson, and they don't play a massive role in the series, but I think the Dickinson parents help to kind of act as this period typical foundation for the other characters of the show to remind us of the actual culture and sentiments of the day. But what I particularly enjoyed about this season is its small but meaningful exploration of their marriage and how their marriage works, and how sometimes it doesn't, because sometimes Emily's mother feels like she's not being heard, feels like she very much fades into the background. And this is someone who enjoys, you know, fulfilling her wifely duties, her traditional wifely duties. She thrives in being a homekeeper, but there are still times where she feels like she's invisible, when her voice is not heard because she's a woman, and she's against that. She also wants appreciation and acknowledgement for what she does. And on top of this, we also once again got some brief but meaningful exploration of their sex lives and the idea that Mama Dickinson still has her wants and needs, okay? It might be the 19th century, but she's not dead. Overall, I really enjoyed this season of Dickinson. I liked exploring the themes of Emily, you know, discovering fame and discovering what it means to have her arts, which is so personal to her, be exposed to the rest of the world. I also liked seeing the genesis of the abolitionist movement and of course the onset of the Civil War. And on top of all of this, of course, you have an incredibly likable, charismatic cast. You have incredible costumes here, okay, and some incredible music. Listen, I love the music in Dickinson, okay? Sometimes it doesn't work for me with the, you know, anachronisms, and I remember people complaining about that with Lovecraft Country. But if you have a problem with the anachronistic music in Lovecraft Country, then best not even bother with Dickinson, okay? Because they take the mick all the time. But I actually really enjoy the music on there. I think it fits somehow. I think especially because you have Hailee Steinfeld at the center of this story, it makes sense to have this 21st century music in it. But I enjoy the music. I enjoy the whole aesthetic of the show. I just think that at times it really struggles with balancing the fact that it is set in the 19th century and the story does center on the real life person, Emily Dickinson, whose fate we ultimately know of, with trying to inject some 21st century sentiments, slang, concepts, you know, social movements in there. It's such a fine line when you're trying to balance those two things that I personally think season 1 did a better job of doing so. In the case of season 2, there were a few too many times where I was just kind of cringing at them trying so hard to inject those 21st century sentiments into the 19th century. And so with all of that being said, I'm going to be giving Dickinson season 2 a 7.5 out of 10. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on Dickinson, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this show down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.